Morning, boys and girls. It's Monday morning. The sun was shining a little while ago, but it's kind of gone in now. Looks like it might cloud up and rain this afternoon. Before we start reading, I want to share with you a connection that I have with the owl on the new barn. We learned on Friday that it was a artificial or fake owl. Farmers use it a lot to keep animals away from their corn and their barns and everything. This case, they probably have it up to keep the owl away. So I don't know whether any of you have ever noticed or not, but there is a hotel right on 82nd Street. It's just when you're coming up Shadeland and you turn to the left to go towards the mall. And right after you go under the interstate bridge, just before you get to Charleston's, there's a hotel. It's called the Hampton Inn. And on the Hampton Inn, there are two fake owls, one on the front sitting up above the door, and one on the side, sitting up on the roof above the door. And when our grandson was little, it used to always be a joke. My husband, Mr. Mike, would wait until after we'd driven by the hotel, and then he would ask our grandson if he saw the owls on the building. And usually he wasn't paying any attention, so he would say no, and Grandpa would say, well, that's because he has flown away to go catch mice in the field. And as the grandson got older, he would start asking Grandpa questions back, like, did you see the owls? Or, maybe we just weren't looking at the owls, and it was just always kind of a joke. So you all have connections with the owls, and the next time you go to Castleton, look there on the Hampton Inn, and you'll see the two of them sitting on the building. Chapter 17, A Surprise Conversation. Poppy woke refreshed. For a moment, she just lay still, luxuriating in her discoveries. She imagined telling her family what a phony Mr. Oakes was. What a delicious moment. Yes, it was time to return home. Realizing that she was very hungry, Poppy first treated herself to a big meal, eating only the plumpest corn kernels. Hadn't she deserved them? Gradually, she ate her way over to the dirt road that ran alongside Dimwood Forest. With her mouth full and her belly tight, she gazed across the wall of pine and fir. She had feared it before, but now, knowing it, she recalled only its dark beauty, its deep fascination. The forest made her think of Erith and her promise. How was she going to get him the salt? She still had no idea. Then and there she vowed that once she got home, she would return, maybe this time with Cousin Basil. Perhaps the two of them could find a way. I'm glad she hasn't forgot her promise to Mr. Erith. Poppy thought about Mr. Oakes, too. Wouldn't it be fun to tell him what she had discovered? The image of it made her grin. The liar. The bully. It was while she was thinking about him that she spied him. Mr. Oakes was perched deep within the foliage on a small tree right by the edge of the forest. If it had not been for the slanting rays of sun, Poppy might never have noticed. It was the light of his glowing eyes that caught her attention. Poppy crept forward. When she came near the row of corn closest to the forest, she looked up again. A moody Mr. Oakax was staring at the barn across the field. He kept moving his head about, back, forward, side to side, hissing and clacking his beak. Sometimes his black talons kneaded the branch with nervous tension. At other times he ruffled his feathers, lifted his wings, let his head sink lower. Poppy could tell he was miserable, sulking. She had to marvel at how different he appeared from the time she'd seen him on his watching tree in the rain. All that glaring and hissing. She had to slap a paw over her mouth to keep from laughing out loud. What fun it would be to humiliate him. Just the idea of it brought a feeling of power. Unable to resist teasing him, she called out, "Mr. Oakax." The owl, taken by surprise, looked up, down, and around. "Here," Poppy cried, "in the corn. It's me, Poppy." Mr. Oakax hunched over and peered in her general direction. "Show yourself," he said harshly. "I'll stay where I am, thank you," Poppy returned. Wedged in as she was among the corn stalks, she felt totally secure. She knew he could not reach her there. "Mr. Oakax," she called, "is it the owl on the barn that you're looking at?" "What is it to you?" he growled. Excuse me. "You're frightened of it, aren't you?" Poppy said. Mr. Oakax opened his beak, but no sound came out. Instead, he kept peering into the corn. Poppy said, "It's awful to be frightened, isn't it?" "What did you say?" "I said it's not fun being frightened, is it?" To this, Mr. Oakax said nothing. "I could tell you a little something about that owl," Poppy called, feeling altogether giddy with her knowledge. "What is that something?" the owl asked. "Want to talk about it?" Poppy offered, suppressing a giggle. "Well, I might as well say it to you. I'm going to tell my family." Mr. Oakax shifted uncomfortably on his perch. "I'll talk," he said. Then he added, "But could we talk more easily? We could talk more easily if I could see you." To Poppy's ears, the owl's tone had shifted. It was not nearly as hostile as it had been. Was she only imagining that? Should she trust him? But even as she asked herself that question, she thought, "Oh, the look on his face when I tell him that the bird he's so frightened of is nothing but a fake." Aloud, she called, "Would you really like to talk about it with me?" "Yes, I would," replied Mr. Oakax. "You seem to be a very smart mouse." Poppy blushed. No one had ever called her smart before. This, she had to admit, was a very different side to Mr. Oakax from what she had known. Ragweed, in his way, had challenged him. As for Father, he had been very timid in his approach. But the owl would respect someone who stood up to him politely but firmly. "Do you really think I'm smart?" she inquired. "I certainly do," the owl said. "Yes, perhaps the two of us should just sit down and talk. The two smart ones. Maybe we can work something out. Poppy felt a stirring of excitement. Here she was, Poppy, talking in a perfectly reasonable way with the great Mr. Oakhacks. It was she, with her new knowledge, who had gained power. Perhaps instead of humiliating him, she could work things out reasonably so the mice could move to Newhouse. Wouldn't that be a trophy to bring home? So thinking, she moved from her hiding place a little onto the dirt road. Yes, Mr. Oakhack said smoothly. Let the two of us talk things over. I should think we could find some reasonable solutions. All right, she said. Boldly, she stepped further out on the road. She looked up. Mr. Oakhax was gone. Where are you? She cried. At that moment, the owl plunged down upon her from behind. Uh-oh. She trusted him. She should have never trusted him. Chapter 18 is called The Battle. Ragweed's earring saved her. So powerful, so swift was Mr. Oakhack's descent that he pushed a wave of air before him and caused the earring to flutter. The flutter felt like the tap of a tiny finger on Poppy's ear. She felt it and whirled. At the last possible second, she saw the owl coming and made a leap to safety. The next moment, however, she realized she had made a terrible mistake. She had leaped not back among the corn, but further onto the open road. Mr. Oakhax was now on the ground, blocking her way to the field. She spun toward the forest. In a second, the owl was up in the air and down on the other side. Once again, he had blocked her way. Not so smart as all that, are you? He sneered. Well, I don't compromise with what I want, he told her. And what I want is you to never get home alive. He made a sudden darting movement to the left. Poppy jumped to the right, but Mr. Oakhax was ahead of her. Just as quickly, he shifted back toward her so that Poppy was forced to halt herself clumsily. There she stood, flat-footed, panting, not sure which way to go. The owl, towering over her, laughed. I told you what would happen if I caught up with you again, didn't I? But this time you won't have that fat porcupine to help you. So saying, he made a snap at her with his beak. Mr. Oakhack's mention of Erith was the reminder Poppy needed. She reached down and yanked the quill from her sash, then held it before her like a sword. At first, Mr. Oakhax blinked. Then he snickered. You don't think one of his quills is going to stop me, do you? That owl on the barn, Poppy panted between hard breathing. It's just a fake. You've been frightened by a fake owl. Mr. Oakhack's beak dropped open. He hesitated. In that moment, Poppy sensed she could have gotten away, but she could not resist another taunt. You're not an owl. You're a chicken, she cried in triumph. For an instant, the two of them, owl and mouse, confronted each other. Then a look of terrible rage passed across the owl's face. Poppy knew then she'd made another blunder. She'd lost her momentary chance of escape. Now there was nothing he'd not do to kill her. And here's a picture of Mr. Ocax making his attack on Poppy. She would have to fight him. Trembling, she flourished the quill. In response, Mr. Ocax spread his wings, then beat down hard with them upon the road. They threw up a cloud of dust. It was hard for Poppy to breathe, much less see. She took a step back, only to hear a sound behind her. Confused, she turned. Hidden by the dust, Mr. Ocax had overleaped the road. Once again, he was behind her. From there, he made a slash at her with his beak. Poppy struck out with her quill. Seeing the quill and realizing the danger to his eyes, the owl pulled back. He glared at Poppy. He snapped his beak. Poppy stared back, grim-faced, grasping for breath, waving the quill before her. "If it takes the whole night, I'll wear you down," Mr. Ocax hissed. "All it takes is one mistake on your part. Then you're done. Finished." He made a forward feint. Poppy danced nimbly back. Mr. Ocax struck again. This time it was not with his beak, but with his talons. Poppy, quill up, dodged the talons with a quick sidestep, but she knew her only hope was to get into the corn and hide. Otherwise, the owl would overpower her. Making sure of her footing, she began to back toward the forest. Just as she had hoped, Mr. Ocax leaped up and landed between her and the trees. It was then that she raced for the corn. Mr. Ocax was just as fast. Grasping her strategy, he barely touched earth when he took a flying hop forward to block her way. He advanced wildly now, snapping and snarling. In response, Poppy slashed wildly with her quill. Once she struck out at the owl's face, but only hit his feathers. But though the blow glanced off harmlessly, it served to infuriate him. Mr. Ocax, closing in, darted his head in and out, side to side. Poppy was bewildered. Then the owl turned briefly away from her. In a flash, she made a successful rolling dive under his wing. She was behind Mr. Ocax at last, on the corn side of the road. She started to run. He turned his head in a complete half circle, saw her, and spun his whole body about. His right wing extended full length. The wingtip struck Poppy a glancing blow to her head. Down she tumbled and landed on her back in the dust. Seeking his advantage, Mr. Ocax pounced, beak open, tongue out, hissing. Poppy whipped the air with the quill. The tip of it pricked the owl's tongue. He screamed in rage and reeled back. Poppy had just enough time to regain her feet. Once more she faced him, quill at the ready. Mr. Ocax stung. Pressed forward now this way, now that. Head bobbing, weaving, viciously snapping with his beak. Increasingly exhausted, Poppy was forced to give ground. She crumpled to her knees. It was the moment the owl had been waiting for. With a powerful kick, he thrust his left paw, talons spread wide, at Poppy's head. Poppy saw the claw coming. Using all of her strength to grip the quill, she held it up with both paws to protect himself and jabbed it into Mr. Okak's claw as it came down. The owl gave a great squawk, fell back, and began to roll about violently. Fearful of losing the quill, her only weapon, Poppy pulled on it with all her might, but the barbs had caught. She could not get the quill loose. She was being dragged and bumped along. Mr. Okak, screeching and flipping his wings wildly, flailed into the air. Before Poppy knew what was happening, she too was in the air. She did tell herself to let go of the quill, but by the time she thought the thought was whole, it was too late. To drop from the height Mr. Okak's had already reached meant a fall to certain death. There was nothing to do but hang on. Okay, this might be a good time to visualize what's going on. Can you close your eyes and think of the owl with the quill sticking in his foot and Poppy hanging on the end, and the owl is up flying high in the air? Wow. I think Poppy's in trouble. Mr. Okak, squawking, hissing, flew like one possessed. Up, down, and around he went, making loops and stalling dives, climbing and twisting, anything and everything to work the quill from his claw. But the more he flexed and twisted, the more the barbs worked themselves into his claw, causing ever more excruciating pain. Poppy hung on. The fact that Mr. Okak's was dragging a claw, and from that claw dangled a mouse, greatly impeded his flying. His flight path became increasingly wild. In his desperate desire to get rid of the pain, Mr. Okak ceased to look where he was heading. Violently, he plunged towards a cornfield. Once over it, he lowered his left claw, and that meant Poppy, deliberately thumping it and her along the corn stalks in the hopes that the quill would be jerked out. Poppy was being battered, but each time she decided to release her hold on the quill, the owl surged forward, causing her to cling to it more than ever. Knowing she could not take much more, Poppy tried to see ahead. Mr. Okak's was skimming low over the corn tops, but when he passed beyond them, he dropped towards the ground. Let go, Poppy told herself, let go. But she was feeling so groggy, her own muscles would not respond. Then she saw what the owl was aiming for, the salt lick, and he was picking up speed. In his madness, he was preparing to strike his claw on that. Poppy had wits enough to sense that if she struck the hard salt, it would be the end for her. Let go, she cried to herself again. This time she did. Down she plummeted. As she did, Mr. Okak's first rose, then dropped, totally out of control. He slammed into the salt head on. So great was the blow that the salt shattered while the owl went tumbling head over tail in an explosion of feathers. After 3 flips, he flopped down like a sack of potatoes onto the ground. As for Poppy, she landed on grass. For a moment she lay there, stunned, battered, and confused. She looked up into the sky but saw nothing. Then she looked across the lawn. She saw him then. Mr. Oacax lay on his back, perfectly still. His claws were drawn up over his chest, slightly curled. The quill still stuck out of the left one. Scattered about among the feathers were chunks of salt. Poppy stumbled to her feet. She took a wobbly step or two toward the cornfield. Then she stopped and looked back. Mr. Oacax had not moved. She stared at him, slowly, not sure if she should believe what she was thinking. She crept closer to the fearsome owl. After every few steps, she paused, looked, and sniffed. Still, there was no movement. Close to Mr. Oacax's head now, Poppy stopped again. The owl's great eyes were wide open, staring up into the sky. His devil-like tufts of feathers were bent. His beak was open. As Poppy watched, it snapped listlessly. Mr. Oacax, no answer. She took a step closer. Mr. Oacax, his head turned slightly. For a moment, his eyes seemed to focus on her. Sometimes, he murmured, sometimes I wonder why I bother to protect you. With that, his beak made a final clack shut. His eyes closed. Poppy knew it then. Mr. Oacax was no longer alive. Wow. I would have never thought that Poppy could win a battle with Mr. Oacax. That was pretty impressive. And not only did she take care of the problem of Mr. Oacax, but when he crashed into the salt lick and the salt went every which way for Sunday, it kind of solved her problem as how she was going to get the salt down for Erith. So Poppy's in pretty good shape right now. So we'll read again tomorrow and see what happens. Bye.